Okay. Now I'm very pleased to present Paul Martin, who is from the University of Nottingham, and also, interestingly enough, from Ningbo in China, as apparently Nottingham University also has a university seat in China, which is a very interesting thing. And he's going to be talking about landscape and gamescape in Dwarf Fortress. Okay? There you go, Paul.
Thank you. So, yes, thank you. I'm Paul Martin from University of Nottingham in China. And I'm going to be talking about landscape and gamescape in Dwarf Fortress. First, I'd like to thank Stefan for a great keynote, and I hope some of the things that I'm saying speak to some of the suggestions that you're making there, especially about how games offer potential for living out sort of spatial concepts or experimenting with spatiality. I think if I was giving this presentation tomorrow, I'd probably be in my room rewriting some of it in light of some of your suggestions, but I'll give it my best shot now. Just to get an idea, who is familiar with Dwarf Fortress? Who's played it? Okay. Well, you don't need to know too much about it. I'll explain what you need to know, but and I'll show a few pictures and things. But I'll start by showing you a couple of representations of Dwarf Fortress. The first is a screenshot, and the second is a video of gameplay. So, okay, this is Et Cascadal. So when you start Dwarf Fortress, it's sort of a management game, a bit like SimCity. The main mode in it is you start off with 7 dwarves, of course, who start a fortress, and you have to sort of manage them as they develop the fortress and reproduce and thrive as a community. So this is a screenshot of what you see when you begin the game. It's this sort of strange, simplistic ASCII graphics. So all the graphics are all from these from the ASCII code sheet, dots and commas and punctuation marks. So this is one representation of Dwarf Fortress. The second one I'm going to show is a video. What's this telling me? No? So this is just a sped up video of me playing Dwarf Fortress. So this is also a representation of Dwarf Fortress. I've got my PC there. This is a wiki that I'm consulting. This is the game. This is a game guide that I've printed out because it's quite a difficult game. So you get the idea. So these are two different. Let me get back in. So these are two different representations of Dwarf Fortress. What do they have in common? Both, most obviously, are representations. The first is a screen grab I made while playing the game. The second is a video from a camera set up above my right shoulder as I play the game. But if both are representations, what exactly are they representations of? The first is of a fictional country called Estatskedal, whose spatio-temporal relations are determined by the Dwarf Fortress software running in the machine and partially output on a screen and in speakers. The second is a representation of me interacting with the software running on a PC, also interacting with the various game guides and wikis that I've got on hand. So what these two representations, the screen grab and the video, demonstrate is that Dwarf Fortress entails a number of spatialities, a number of temporalities. So these can be located on the screen in the room I'm playing in, as they're defined in the computer program running on some hardware. And I want to use the term Gamescape to think about these different spatio-temporal relations that exist in the moment of play. For this reason, I'd suggest that the video is a more thorough representation of the Gamescape. It's still reductive, but it contains more of the registers or spatialities that exist in the moment of play. It gives a better idea of the range of spatio-temporal registers that are at play. And the reason I'm using the term Gamescape is because I want to make use of literature on landscape to attempt to describe how these different spatialities and temporalities dynamically coexist in the game. And particularly, I want to make use of Jonathan Wiley's argument, the cultural geographer, that at the heart of landscape is tension. The idea of tension is central to the idea of landscape. And I want to say that a similar tension between different spatio-temporal registers can be found in this Gamescape that sort of holds them together in tension. And this, in turn, will be used to argue that Dwarf Fortress thematizes presence by foregrounding these spatio-temporal tensions in its Gamescape. I'm going to say it does this in two ways. First, the Gamescape folds within it a subject-object relationship between player and game, or between player and certain representations of the game, at the same time that the practical activity of play collapses this distinction between subject and object. And second, the landscape presents, as in it makes present, both the past and the future, and holds these two temporalities in tension. So this paper is to do with the spatio-temporal aesthetic of Dwarf Fortress. And by aesthetic here, I mean the capacity that art has to reflect aspects of life, to draw attention to mundane experiences. And this aspect of art can be seen in some approaches, for example, to still life. So Norman Bryson entitles his study of still life "Looking at the Overlooked," this idea that still life foregrounds the mundane or aestheticizes it in some way. D.H. Lawrence wrote of the still lifes of Paul Cézanne that it brought out the appliness of apples. So it sort of confronts something that's everyday and doesn't make you think about it in a new way, but allows you to experience it in a new way. So if Cézanne manages to foreground the appliness of apples, then I want to argue that Dwarf Fortress foregrounds the presenceness of presence. So presence here, I'm not thinking of it as a quantitative category, as it sometimes is viewed in virtual reality literature, particularly presence literature. In this literature, certain forms of VR or certain forms of media are seen to be more or less conducive to presence or virtual presence. That is, some forms of media can trick the user into believing that there's no mediation taking place, that they're smoothly present in some fictional or virtual realm. In computer games, it seems to me that this is a less interesting project than trying to think about how engagement with these technologies change the quality of presence or the texture of presence. And this is partly because computer games don't really ever trick the player into forgetting about the mediation. And I would suggest that the mediation is part of the pleasure of games. So this requires an understanding of presence that's never more or less, but is constantly changing in its quality and texture. So every activity involves presence. Knitting a jumper, or reading a book, or playing a game. The people involved in this are always present, and one is no more present than the other. The character of this presence depends on the technologies being used, the tools being used, the bodily configurations that are encouraged or appropriate to these kinds of activities. What is unusual about computer games, and this is why they're spatio-temporally aesthetic in a way that knitting a jumper isn't, is that they're capable of foregrounding this presence, or particularly good at foregrounding this presence. So presence can become an issue in computer games. This is precisely the opposite of how presence is understood in the VR literature. There, the smoother things are, the better. But I want to suggest that presence in games is interesting not to the extent that it mimics some real presence, but to the extent that it thematizes everyday presence. Or at least this is one of the sources of interest. Gamescape is a term used here to think about the spatialities and temporalities of gameplay as they jostle together in the moment of play. We might try to name a few of these different spatialities, which is done in game studies from time to time. We saw the Michael Nietzsche diagram in the keynote of trying to name these different sorts of spatial planes that exist. So we might think of a computer program defining certain spatio-temporal relations as one spatial plane, a screen representing them, an interface making them accessible. The gamescape folds within it a number of these spatialities and temporalities in such a way that these can't be reliably separated out. So such separation can be useful for conceptual clarity. However, there is a danger of an overly formal delineation that doesn't take into account how it is we experience this space. The term gamescape is useful because if understood in the terms suggested by Wiley, it holds in tension within the overlapping and jostling spatio-temporalities that these distinctions entail. Phenomenologically, these spaces are not distinct with some interaction between them, and they're not distinct components like the components in a mechanical watch. Rather, we might think of it as a soup. I know I'm mixing metaphors here, but phenomenologically, we don't experience these as different components, but different ingredients that can't be really separated out in the experience of tasting them. A phenomenological analysis is committed to describing accurately this soup-like experience of gameplay and the gamescape. Jonathan Wiley describes tension as being at the heart of landscape, and I'll discuss two ways in which he does so here. One way of thinking about landscape is as an object in relation to a viewing subject. Here, the landscape painting is seen as an object over there on the wall of the gallery in relation to a distant viewing gallery visitor. Or the landscape is constituted as an object in relation to an artist or a rambler who frames it in a certain way according to certain conventions. As an object that stands in a particular relation to a subject viewer, the landscape or material representation of the landscape can bear symbolic resonances. And this is seen in certain Marxist approaches like Cosgrove or Mitchell, approaches that see, for example, the exploitative relations of production inscribed in or erased from the tradition of landscape painting. So Raymond Williams said, a landscape painting never depicts a working country, that the relations of production are always erased from it. This is treating landscape as an object that carries symbolic meanings. Some phenomenological approaches see landscape not as an object over there, but as emerging through activity of some viewer, but also of agents or actors in the landscape, and bearing not symbolic weight, but rather the traces of this activity. The over-there-ness of the landscape is removed through what Heidegger calls deseverance, a process through which the distant is brought into Dasein's sphere of action, or the sphere of action of human existentiality. So that's the object, and the landscape as an object, or the landscape as emerging through practical activity. You can also think of tensions in the landscape to do with time and temporality. In the temporality of the landscape, Tim Ingold describes a central tension in the temporal character of landscape. This temporal character presents itself partly in relation to the activities of those who have dwelt there. Ingold sees landscape as pregnant with the past and the tasks of people who have lived there and are living there. So he talks about the taskscape as creating the landscape through activities. And this suggests more than the inscription or ghostly persistence of the past in the present, but rather a fertile and ever-emerging past presented. Each engagement with the landscape enfolds within it both retentions from the past and protensions of the future, and these are held in some kind of tension within the idea of the landscape. Okay, I missed a slide. So what has this got to do with Dwarf Fortress? So a brief introduction. Dwarf Fortress is a computer game set in a Tolkien-esque fantasy sort of medieval world of elves and dwarves and all the rest. It has 3 modes of play, 2 of which I'll discuss here. The first is Fortress mode and the second is Adventure mode. So in Fortress mode, the player is tasked with managing an ever-expanding community of dwarves. So this is what I mentioned before. It's this sim kind of management game where you've got to... it doesn't work quite like SimCity. You make lists of things that your dwarves need to do, and then the dwarves will carry them out. So you say, we need to mine here, or we need to build a chair and put it there, or whatever. And then Adventure mode is a gameplay mode where the player can return to a previously generated world as a single character. So a single character who has a position in the game environment and can move around. So usually the fortress mode is really difficult. So usually you fail quite quickly and you have to abandon your fortress. And the idea is in adventure mode, you then come back to this place 100 or 1,000 years later as an adventurer, and you rediscover this abandoned fortress. So the initial engagement with the represented landscape in Dwarf Fortress is as an entirely alien object. Not only is it not clear what the player should do with this, but it's not entirely clear what it is, what the player is looking at. The landscape as represented on screen is a distant object of contemplation for the player. But this isn't to say that this initial engagement with Dwarf Fortress, the Dwarf Fortress gamescape, is not characterized by practical activity. But this activity gathers within the gamescape resources from elsewhere, mainly game guides, fan art, wikis, and things like that. In this sense, the gamescape reaches out into spaces beyond this represented landscape. Beyond the represented landscape and the interface between player and software. While the represented landscape is, in a sense, distanced from the player, the gamescape in total, including wikis, fan art, guidebook, is still a site of the player's practical activity and is shaped by this activity. There's a tension then between spatialities through which Dwarf Fortress is encountered as an object and spatialities through which it emerges as a site of practical activity. In the paper I go into a little bit about labor relations in the gamescape of Dwarf Fortress, but I won't talk too much about it. But if we think about how labor is represented or discussed in Dwarf Fortress, it's something that's discussed across these spatial registers, both in the labor of the dwarves and how they do things and how they work, but also in the labor of the player, in how the player exercises their labor over the game world. So if we think of temporal tensions in the gamescape, again, for Tim Ingold, the landscape is not viewed at a particular moment, but rather from a particular moment. That is, the past and the future are made present or folded into the landscape in one's encounter with it. Many games particularly from the fantasy genre. So this is Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, another kind of Tolkien-esque game, though of a very different kind. And this game has a landscape where, as you walk around it, as you adventure in it, you see ruins from a bygone era, and this sort of gives the world this sense of history, that it's been lived in before the player got there. And that's important to deepening the sense of it as a world, right? Dwarf Fortress goes further than this, embedding the history of the generated world at the level of the simulation, and also having the player bear witness to the passing of time in the world generation phase of the game. So the first thing that you've got to do in Dwarf Fortress is generate your world, or have the computer generate your world. So this is the world generation screen. You put in a few parameters and you watch as this world develops, is born and develops. So you can see the temperature is set, the mountains are built and eroded, rivers come into being and run dry. And also, if you see the Age of Myth and year 250, this is the world generation screen at the end of the world generation process. So it's gone through 250 years, and my game is going to begin at the year 250. But already, these numbers have been incrementing. So the number of historical figures who have preceded me in this world are 22,729, and I've seen those go up. The number of dead people who have lived and died in the world is counted. The number of events like wars or civilizations being born or passing away is counted, is tallied. And below here, you can see a text description during the adventure mode of the game, after you start playing, where you discover an engraving that tells you something about one of these events. So the events are just numbers in the world generation phase, but later on you discover what those events are through engravings that the dwarves make in your fortress. So this witnessing of the birth and development of the world means that retentions of the world's development are not experienced as designed objects with only a fictional history, as in the Elder Scrolls, but as both elements of the simulation and as processes that the player somehow lived through, witnessed. They're in this way incorporated more fully into the gamescape. By witnessing the development of the world in this way, the player is brought into its history. So this is just a diagram sort of suggesting the different retentions and protensions of past and future that the player encounters in playing the various modes of Dwarf Fortress. So the future and the past are presented in the play between modes. Adventure mode replaces the player in relation to a represented landscape that the player has previously been with in a radically different way. While playing in Fortress mode, the gamescape folds in the retentions of the world generation phase, but also folds in the protensions of adventure mode. That is, the player's presence in the gamescape is colored by the knowledge that what is being crafted is a landscape capable of being part of an adventure mode. So I know that I'll be able to adventure and find the things that I've made. Part of the appeal of playing in adventure mode is encountering these retentions of your fortress. So the gamescape of Fortress mode is filled with the protensions of adventure mode, and the gamescape of adventure mode is filled with the retentions of Fortress mode. So I think I'm out of time, so I'll leave it there and ask for any questions.
Yeah, questions? Okay.
Hello, I'm Jon Arenda from the University of Jyväskylä. I have a question about your concept of presence. In a sense, Dwarf Fortress is special in the sense you showed us a video of you playing Dwarf Fortress, and while you do that, you consult the game, the wiki, and a guide. And I was wondering how that is different in sense of presence compared to, say, me playing a easier game where I don't need all of that equipment to go through the game.
So what I want to get away from, and I think this is something that Stefan was talking about earlier in one of the questions, is the idea that there's ever a smooth becoming a part of some fictional realm. I suppose, I mean, I filmed myself there, so I was performing, right? I mean, I was trying to suggest more that this is an activity that I'm using my hands in different ways, interacting with different things. But even if you're not so obviously attending to other things, I think even in first-person shooters, there's more complexity to the relationship between the player and the space than simply tricking oneself into believing that I'm there. But I suppose, I mean, different games aim for that in different ways. But I would like to think about this is an easier example of thinking of the texture of presence, because it's easy to think about the different text that you're using, the roughness of it. But I would like to try to think of even a first-person shooter, photorealistic and all the rest, or Oculus Rift, in terms of the material that you're using, the gamepad that you're using, that is still there. It's still like a part of your sense of being in the world. So there's always equipment apart from the represented world.
We can manage one more question if there's anybody has something. Yeah? Stefan?
Just a question concerning the concept of landscape. I wonder, I mean, I think it's very appropriate to use it for interpretation of games. Did you come across the idea that any landscape theory, I mean, the ones you mentioned, they always take already images of nature as a landscape? So they are already breaking out the real space by already talking about images, actually, the sun, and engaging actually with the image and not with landscape. So we could say landscape theory originally was already a theory of media.
Well, part of the reason why I like this idea of landscape, but also part of the reason why I think it might be very troublesome and problematic, is that it means so many different things in different disciplines. So I mean, Tim Ingold isn't really talking about materially represented landscapes. He's talking about, so Edward Casey talks about landscape as always already represented. There are different ways of materially re-representing the landscape in maps or in landscape paintings, but the rambler in the countryside who frames the countryside is, as soon as he encounters it, is landscaping it. So it's not necessarily a theory of media, but it's always a theory of representation. So what I suppose that the parallel of that would be in games is that the gamescape is always something that's produced in gaming by the imagination, by the relationship between imagination and technology. It's not something that I'm saying exists out there, but something that is in evolution, dynamically changing through the player's imagination of what space they're inhabiting.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Another applause maybe for the... So now we...